thank you once again for stopping by the Infidel Guy Real Audio Show brought to you by freespeech.org. This evening, I have a special guest with us. His name is Massimo Pigliucci. He is an associate professor in the departments of botany and of ecology and evolutionary biology at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. Massimo has debated several theists, including William Craig, Dwayne Gish, and Kent Hovind. I myself had the pleasure of attending that debate, and it was quite interesting. He produces a monthly column called Rationally Speaking, and he has also authored his newest book, Tales of the Rational. Mr. Massimo Pigliucci, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Not a problem. Mr. Pigliucci, what exactly do you do at the University of Tennessee?
Good question. My mother always asks me that. Essentially, I'm a professional evolutionary biologist, if you can believe that there is such a thing. I run a research lab at the university, and I teach several courses in ecology and evolutionary biology. And my research lab is focused on the topic of genotype-environment interaction, which is the technical term for nature-nurture problems. So we try to understand how genes and environment interact to shape the behavior and morphology of organisms. I work on plants in particular, but some of my colleagues do the same thing with animals and even with humans.
Okay. What exactly does that mean? You say you work with plants and you work with genetics and you study evolution in plants?
Correct. One of the things that we do is we try to understand how is it that plants adapt to, for example, changes in environmental conditions. As you know, one of the things that have been projected over the next few years, for example, is an increase in the CO2 in the atmosphere, which also will mean an increase in temperature on the planet worldwide. And one of the interesting questions is how are plants and animals going to react to changes in CO2 and temperature. And so that is the kind of general study that we do here. In particular, recently we have actually done research on the genetics and ecology of what is called shade avoidance. You know, plants have a problem with trying to find as much light as possible, so they want to avoid shade as much as possible. And they have several interesting mechanisms by which they do that. And one of the things we try to do is to figure out how exactly they do it, how do they determine that they're surrounded by shade, and how they avoid competition with other plants, for example.
Interesting. In your research, Massimo, have you, and this is a question that you're going to, I'm sure you hear all the time, in your research, have you seen speciation?
As in the origin of new species? No, not in my research. I don't work on speciation. There are some of my colleagues who do, however. And the question really is, has anybody ever observed the origin of a new species? And the answer is yes, rarely. It doesn't happen very often, obviously, because it is a fairly slow process that occurs over what we call evolutionary time as opposed to ecological time. Evolutionary time is a fairly long period of time, essentially. But it does happen enough that it has been observed several times, for example, during the last century. In the book that you mentioned in the beginning that I wrote this year, that it was published this year, there is a chapter in which there is a table with lists and references, several examples of speciation, some of them in plants, some of them in animals, including mammals. In that particular case, I believe several species of rodents. So yeah, people do observe those occurrences, but they are very rare. It's like if you wish, like an astronomer observing a supernova explosion. They happen and they are observable, but it's a stroke of luck if you can get one.
Interesting. I know in your research you've created a new, well, not new species. It's definitely the same. I think it's the same species, but I've looked on your website and you've done some research with plants. It seems like you've done some work in making a plant more complex or something of that nature. I'm not quite sure the technicalities.
Yeah, what you were looking at probably are several pictures that we took in my lab of mutants that are of a fairly common plant. It's a weed that belongs to the mustard family, so it's a little mustard plant. And the interesting thing that we found was that under laboratory conditions and control conditions, it can produce mutations that actually make this plant, when it's young, when it's a little plant, look like something very, very different from what it's supposed to look like. And in fact, it looks like an entirely different kind of plant that has been widely known and studied in plant biology. Now, that's not an example of speciation, meaning that we have not actually created a new species under laboratory condition, although people have done that too, by the way, especially with plants. It's not that difficult. But what we've done essentially is to show that there are some mutations that cause fairly large changes in the morphology of these organisms, and yet these organisms live very nicely. They don't have any problem. They have a good reproduction, and therefore they're fit organisms. And yet they look like something very different. So in that sense, we have demonstrated under control conditions that you can make fairly large changes over a fairly short period of time. We're talking about a few generations here of this plant. That is a major advance, I guess, in terms of understanding how morphologies change. People have done this before with other organisms, especially in animals. It has been done too. So it's not something that is entirely new, but it has never been done with this particular plant, which is important because the species that we're studying is very useful from a genetic point of view. A lot of people worldwide work on these plants because it's very easy to manipulate and to play with, and so we can learn a lot about from it essentially.
Interesting. So this is something that would not have occurred naturally, or? Actually,
it does occur naturally, and except that it's much more rare. Spontaneous mutations are more rare than laboratory mutations, simply because we can manipulate the environment in such a way that the mutations are easier to occur and to detect. And so you could say that what we've done is essentially to replicate in the laboratory condition something that happens rarely in nature. And so if in nature you can find, a plant out of a million that has that kind of morphology, in the laboratory you can find a lot more in a fairly short period of time, and then you can study them at your ease.
Interesting. We're with Massimo Pigliucci. He is associate professor in the departments of botany, and also what's the other department? It is
ecology and evolutionary biology.
That's right, ecology and evolutionary biology. Speaking of evolutionary biology, what is evolution?
That's a good question. If you ask different people, they'll give you completely different answers. There are two answers that evolutionary biologists will give you. One is Darwin's classical definition. Evolution is modification with descent, or descent with modification, depending which way you want to put it first. In other words, it is about changes over time of organisms that are connected to each other by the fact that they are descendants of each other.
Okay.
However, this change can happen. It can happen in a variety of different ways. And Darwin suggested that the main way, the most important factor in affecting this change is natural selection. If you ask many modern population biologists or evolutionary biologists, what they will tell you is that evolution is a change in gene frequencies.
Okay.
That is, every time that in a population you have a significant change in the frequency of any gene, you're essentially witnessing evolution. As you can tell, this is much less glamorous than the typical claims of creationists who think that evolution has to be about, for example, the origin of species. Yes, evolution is also about the origin of species, and is also about the origin of new morphological structures and new behaviors, but that happens only once in a time. Most of evolution, quite frankly, is pretty boring. It happens every day under your very nose, and it's very slow and very inconsequential. And from time to time, you have some more interesting stuff. The evolutionary biologist Stephen Gould once put it very nicely. He said that evolution is pretty much like baseball. Most of the time, nothing happens, but then if you blink at the wrong moment, you miss all the action.
That's interesting. There has been some usage of the terms microevolution and macroevolution by creation scientists, which state that there is a war going on in the field of biology and evolutionary biology with these two terms. Is this true, and what do the terms mean? And
right. Those are really unfortunate terms, because that debate was going on in evolutionary biology back during the 30s and 40s, and it has been settled toward the end of the 1940s. And essentially the agreement among evolutionary biologists is that there is no distinction between micro and macro evolution. They're essentially, one is the other one writ large. So macro evolution, which is evolution over a long period of time, or evolution of novel structures, or evolution above the species level, sometimes is defined as. It's simply the same thing as everyday microevolution, which happens within species, except that it is over a long period of time. Mm-hmm. Essentially, there are no distinct mechanisms, at least none that we know of, that operate at those two different levels. The only reason that one can talk about macro versus microevolution is because we have a fossil record, and the fossil record documents macroevolution. By definition, it documents differences among species, or even at higher taxonomic levels, such as differences between genera or families of organisms. But for an evolutionary biologist, for a practicing evolutionary biologist, essentially there is no difference between the two. I mean, the two are exactly the same thing. It's just that one happens over a very long period of time, and the other one happens daily.
Interesting. Human beings, there are, and maybe this is microevolution, there are a few human beings in this world who cannot get the cannot get HIV.
Right.
As a result of the enzyme that normally coats the cells.
Right.
Would this be a form of microevolution?
Yeah, that is a form of microevolution. And in fact, it's very interesting that one of the best examples that we have of evolution happening under our very nose is for a variety of infectious diseases such as AIDS or other things. Mm-hmm. You can observe directly the fact that the epidemic strikes, and then there are some individuals that are resistant to whatever agent is causing the epidemics, a virus in the case of AIDS or a bacterium, and those individuals are doing better. They're surviving, and their mutations, their DNA, of course, is going to be propagated in the population, and eventually a large section of the population becomes obviously over historical times, becomes resistant. And that's the very way in which we think evolution works all the time. Another example that is very similar to it, it concerns the resistance of pests, for example, insects, to pesticides, to insecticides. It works the same way. The first time that you use the new agent, that is a novel environment. It's a novel stress for those insects that they never encountered before, mm-hmm. So they die by the millions. But what you're doing there is to select for the few very, very efficiently, for the few that are actually resistant because they have mutations that allows them to avoid the effects of the pesticide. Well, those few selected individuals are the ones that, of course, are going to reproduce, and in a few generations, you're going to find that your insects are going to be entirely resistant or by and large resistant to the insecticides. This is a very interesting problem for human health, as you might imagine, mm-hmm. because probably you've heard about this debate in medicine about trying to limit the use of antibiotics, for example. Well, mm-hmm. the reason you need to limit the use of antibiotics is because every time you use antibiotics to fight some kind of infection, you're essentially doing natural selection against the infectious agent. Mm-hmm. And so you are causing evolution to occur. And now it might work on the moment, on the spot, but then again, you're selecting for these new resistant bacteria or viruses, and therefore the next time that that's going to happen, it's not going to work as well. And so if you keep using large doses of antibiotics, one of the reasons people do that is because they don't understand evolution. If they did, they will realize that it's a bad idea to overuse those kind of defenses, because all you're doing is essentially to select the agent for resistance. And it works very well. Like
antibacterial soap.
Right. Yes. any antibacterial, antiviral, anything. Let me give you another example. Cancer is a good example of natural selection occurring inside one's own body. Okay. It's very well known that certain forms of cancer, if they're taken early enough, they're curable, right? With a variety of ways. You can do chemotherapy, or you can do whatever, either chemical or radiation treatment. Well, the problem is, especially if you use chemical treatments, is that you have to do it in a way that are absolutely and completely effective the first time around. Because if you leave any cancer cell alive, what you're doing is to select for those cells that are actually resistant to whatever chemicals you've used to combat the cancer. So the next time around, that cell is going to reproduce and it's going to create a new tumor, and you're going to use the same chemical. It's not going to work. because natural selection has done its course, and now that cancer is resistant to the chemical agent.
Interesting. We are with Massimo Pigliucci. He's an associate professor at the University of Tennessee in the departments of botany and evolutionary biology. Well, actually, there's two departments. There's botany and of ecology and evolutionary biology. You have a question, Mr. Massimo, from, looks like Simplest, that's what he calls himself. He says, from his understanding, some plants are not male or female, but reproduce asexually. Right. How does this occur, evolutionarily speaking?
It's an interesting question. The study of the evolution of sex is a very active area of research in evolutionary biology. In fact, my department is right now hiring several people, and a couple of the people that we're interviewing work actively on the evolution of sex. In terms of asexual reproduction, usually this works this way. If we're talking about plants or animals, in bacteria it works in a slightly different fashion. But if we're talking about plants or animals, usually asexual plants or animals are derived by mutation from sexual ones. So the asexual ones are sexual individuals that lost the ability of reproduce sexually. That may have some advantages sometimes, depending on the conditions. For example, suppose that a plant or an animal arrives on a new island where by migration, either because the seeds are being dispersed or whatever, the animal has actually gone there by migration. And suppose that animal or plant is the only member of its own species to be on that island. Well, if you're a sexual species, essentially you're dead, because if you don't have a partner to reproduce with, to mate with, that's the end of your lineage, and you're going to be extinct at the end. Your lineage is going to be extinct at the end of that lifetime of that individual. But if the individual has developed by mutation the ability to reproduce asexually, then it's got no problem. It can do it literally all by itself.
Right.
And therefore it can produce progeny, and it can establish a population in the new environment, even though initially at least there are no other members of its own species other than the ones that it is producing asexually. So that is one of the situations under which asexual reproduction is advantageous. There are disadvantages, however, and a lot of asexual lineages eventually go extinct. And one of the reasons why they go extinct is because they tend to be much less genetically variable. Essentially, you are reproducing always the same kind of genes. There is no much variation you can import into an asexual lineage because there's few genes to begin with. There's copies always of the same stuff. And if the environment changes in a significant manner, and those particular genes are not going to be able to withstand environmental pressure, then the whole lineage or the whole population goes extinct. So the advantage of asexuality is that you can establish a new population even without sexual partners. But on the other hand, the disadvantage is if the environment changes significantly, the likelihood of extinction is much higher.
Interesting. Well, we have a debate going on here in the chat room. What is the difference between natural and artificial selection?
The difference between natural and artificial is simply on who is the agent. In the case of artificial selection, the agent is human beings. So we select, for example, cattle or plants for whatever purposes we need them. In the case of natural selection, nobody's doing the selecting as far as we can tell. It's just the environment, which is selecting individuals that are capable to reproduce in that particular environment or not. So the selection is unconscious, essentially. There is no conscious entity that we can tell. That's the only difference. Otherwise, it works pretty much the same way. And in fact, Darwin, when he published The Origin of Species in 1859, one of his first chapters was on artificial selection to explain how natural selection could work. He said, look, natural selection works exactly the same way as artificial selection, except that there is no human to make the selection. It's not a conscious effort. The results are different in one sense. In the case of natural selection, the criterion, essentially, if you want to call it that way, as I said, it's not conscious, so it's really inappropriate to call it that criterion, but the criterion of selection is the reproductive fitness of the organism itself. So essentially, the organisms that survive better and that reproduce more are the ones that leave more descendants. In the case of artificial selection, on the other hand, humans arbitrarily decide what's good and what's not. And so if you want, larger and larger corn, for example, or more and more milk from your cows, that's going to be your criterion of fitness, regardless of how natural selection would have done things. It's unlikely that natural selection would have, for example, selected for large overproduction of milk in cows, simply because that comes at a cost, so the cows can't do other things if they keep producing that much milk. But if the environment is determined by humans through artificial selection, then that's the way it works. So essentially, there's no difference except for the fact that, of course, in one case, one is conscious and the other one is not.
Okay. Are there any transitional forms?
Yeah, plenty. There is, for one thing, we need to be clear what one means by transitional forms.
Okay.
If you look, there are two meanings of the term, and the two meanings often get confused. And again, Darwin himself actually pointed out this confusion already at the end of the last century, and unfortunately, some people are still maintain that confusion. The two versions, the two meanings of this. In one case, let's say that we're talking about the evolution of humans from other great apes. Okay. Well, in one case, one can say, okay, well, let's look at humans and at the closest relatives of humans, the closest living relatives of humans among other primates. Well, those closest relatives would be the chimpanzees, the bonobos, which are the pygmy chimpanzees, and then a little further away, meaning a little less related to us, gorillas, a couple of species of gorillas, and then even further away, orangutans. Well, an intermediate might be, therefore, something between a human and a chimpanzee. But that is the wrong way of thinking about it, because chimpanzees are not, we don't derive from chimpanzees. We're simply what is called, technically speaking, the sister taxon of chimpanzees. That is, we share a common ancestor with the chimpanzees. It's like saying that, you have a brother, and you're going to ask, well, what's in between you and your brother? Well, nothing is between you and your brother, because you don't derive from each other. You're not one descendant of the other. You're both descendants of your parents. And so what you really have to look at is your parents in order to understand how you came about. And here is the problem. The problem is that in most cases, although not in all cases, but in most cases, and certainly in the case of humans, the parents are dead. They're fossil. You can find them only in the fossil records. So the fossil record is really where you have to go in order to find so-called transitional forms or intermediate forms. Now, that's all nice and dandy, except that, of course, the probability of anything to fossilize is pretty small. Okay. And the probability of something to fossilize is higher in certain environments. For example, for certain aquatic organisms that live in the bottom of the sea, or for certain organisms that live in ponds with very particular conditions that facilitate fossilization. Human beings and other primates in Africa live for the most time on dry land in an environment like the savanna or even a forest in which fossilization is very rare. So in fact, we're lucky to have some intermediate forms at all. Most people keep asking, why is it that we don't find more intermediates between the great apes and humans? And my response is, well, I think we're lucky to have any of those, given what we know about the conditions of fossilization. But we do have several. And what we have, for example, in the case of human lineage, are several different species that are found at distinct times in back in geological time, all the way back to a few million years ago, starting with the Australopithecines, and then more recently with Homo erectus and Homo habilis and things of that sort. Those are all pretty good intermediates. In other cases, in the case of, for example, many invertebrates, like snails, for example, or like trilobites, there are a lot more intermediates. That's because these organisms tend to live in environments in which fossilization is much more easy to achieve. And so we actually have a lot of intermediate forms in those cases. We have many interesting intermediate forms for several kinds of dinosaurs. We have a lot of intermediate forms for several kinds of mammals. So, yeah, the intermediates are there. Usually you find them only in paleontological collections. When you go to a museum, you only find some of the best preserved specimens, because obviously that's what makes an impression on the general public. Although you will see some intermediate forms in there too. But if you actually spend time into a research collection in any major university that has a paleontological collection, misconception, you'll see that there are literally tens of thousands of intermediate forms of all sorts of organisms. In some cases, we have more, as I said. In some cases, we have less, depending on the historical accidents and the environment in which these organisms used to live.
Interesting. One thing you mentioned earlier, you talked about that chimpanzees and us, we're related, but we did not evolve from them.
Right.
This is a misconception that many creationists love to debate with me and my other fellow evolutionists and skeptics and atheists out there. They continue to argue this point. As a matter of fact, Kent Hovind's comments, and he loves to utilize this, I haven't seen a banana turn into a man.
Right.
And what you don't understand is that, and I'd like you to expound on this, is that, well, gorillas didn't come from gorillas. Technically, if you look at it, bananas didn't come from bananas. I mean, everything evolved from something totally unlike itself, but through random mutation.
I pointed out to him a couple of times. I debated with Ken Hovind a couple of times, as you know, once in Atlanta and once very recently here in Knoxville. And I pointed out to him that he must be having some kind of psychological problems with bananas, because he quotes bananas all over the place during his presentations, and I don't understand what his point is. Obviously, human beings don't come from bananas.
Mm-hmm.
There's no question about it. No evolution biologist has ever said anything of the sort. What did happen is that bananas, if you like, or any other plant, and human beings do share a common ancestor.
Right.
Now, that common ancestor is way, way back in time. We're talking about very simple multicellular organisms before the actual evolution of flowering plants, and certainly before the evolution of vertebrates. So we're talking at least, my guess would be more than 500 million years ago, is what the time frame that we're looking at is. And of course, at that time, you would not have recognized neither a banana nor a human being, nor anything that looks anything like it. So it's really a misconception to say, well, I haven't seen bananas evolving into human beings. Of course they don't, and they wouldn't. As I said a minute ago, not even chimpanzees evolve into human beings. We have common ancestors. And it's like, again, the same thing as saying when creationists want to say that, well, if we derive from apes, how come that there are apes out there?
Yes.
Well, that is a misconception that should be fairly easy to see if you stop for a minute and think about the fact that just because you are the descendant of your grandmother, for example,
mm-hmm.
that doesn't mean that your grandmother is going to be alive at the same time that you're you for your entire life, right? You're still her descendant, but eventually you're going to be there and she's going to be gone. Well, the same thing goes for evolution. Species descend from other species, but at one point, the overwhelming majority of species that ever existed on Earth have gone extinct, and therefore, obviously, your ancestors, your recent ancestors, are likely to have gone extinct by the time you're doing this kind of reasoning and analysis. Not to speak, of course, not to mention of very old ancestors. Instead of your grandmother, let's talk about your grandmother. That would be getting closer to the banana thing that Alvin has. And of course, in that case, not only they're dead and buried a long time ago, but they actually, in the case of evolutionary change, look very different, so different that you might not even recognize them as one of your ancestors. Now, how do we know then that they are our ancestors?
Right.
Well, for one thing, it's because of molecular evidence. If you look at the DNA, for example, of flowering plants, let's take a banana,
mm-hmm.
for Armin's sake, and a human being, you actually see that there are a remarkable number of similarities. A lot of the genes are actually the same, or nearly the same, and some, of course, are very different because obviously the genes that are going to making a banana are very different from the genes that are going to making a human being. But the number of similarities is so high that it cannot be explained by chance. I mean, the odds against a flowering plant having the same kind of genes and pretty much made in the same manner than animals or the fungi are astronomically low. And so the obvious conclusion from the point of view of evolutionary biology is that, well, we all inherited those genes from our ancestors, and those are ancestors, therefore, in some sense, mm-hmm. were the predecessors of both bananas and human beings. But that doesn't mean that there was ever anything that looked like an intermediate between a banana and a human being. You find those only in bad science fiction movies.
You mentioned earlier about your guess about a common ancestor. You mentioned billions of years ago. What evidence do we have that these organisms have existed billions of years ago, and what tools do we have to measure this unit of time?
Essentially two kinds of evidence. One is the one that I just mentioned, which is the molecular evidence. Mm-hmm. You can measure now fairly accurately the difference in DNA between any two organisms. And since we know, roughly speaking, I mean, we're not talking anything precise here, but we know, roughly speaking, what is the amount of time that it takes for a mutation to occur in in any part of an organism, in any part of a genome. Therefore, you can count the differences essentially between in the DNA of two organisms, and knowing how often one of those differences actually occurs under natural conditions, you can simply multiply the two numbers and get a good estimate of when was the last time that those two shared a common ancestor. That's one way you do it. It's not terribly precise, meaning that it has a certain amount of error, like everything really that you do in science. But it is precise enough to tell you that, for example, plants and human beings share the last common ancestors way more than 500 million years ago. That may be, give or take, 100 million years easily. But over that period, over that time scale, 100 million years is not that much. It certainly didn't happen yesterday. It didn't happen, 10 million years ago or anything of that sort. The other way to do it is, of course, through the fossil record. Okay. Now, in terms of the fossil record, there is a misconception that is very prevalent among creationists. The idea goes on the creationist side that, look, the fossil record is a matter of circularity because you're essentially using the sequence of fossils to date the rocks. And then you're turning around and telling us that those rocks are very ancient, and therefore that those fossils must be very ancient. If geologists or paleontologists were doing that kind of job, they would be fired immediately from any science department. The amazing thing about creationists, for example, like Ken Hovind, is that if you listen to them, scientists are really like a bunch of idiots. They really don't know what they're doing, and if they would just stop and think about it for a few seconds, they will realize the errors of their ways, and they would embrace creationism. Well, it doesn't quite work that way. I mean, these are people that actually spend their lifetimes studying these things, so it's not quite that easy to figure out if a scientist is wrong. Mind you, scientists can be definitely wrong and have been wrong in the past, and they probably will be wrong in the future on several accounts, but it's not that easy. What paleontologists really do is they can date rocks in what are called with absolute methods. Absolute methods are methods that are independent of the sequence of fossils. Okay. In those strata. Those are absolute methods. There are several of them, and among the most used are dating, radioactive dating, radioactive decay dating, and normally that is associated with carbon dating. Carbon dating is actually not used very much in paleontology. In fact, it's not used at all because carbon decays over a very short period of time. So carbon dating is actually useful in archaeology, but not much in paleontology. Oh, okay. And it's too fast. There are several other elements, on the other hand, that do decay over a much longer period of time, and therefore they can work as good clocks for long periods, long geological periods. But essentially what you have, the principle is very simple. The application is pretty complicated because it's not that easy to make this kind of measurements, so you have to do it on different samples of rocks, and you have to have independent confirmation from several laboratories before somebody believes you. But the principle is actually very simple, and the idea is simply that there are certain elements which spontaneously decay radioactively. They essentially change form spontaneously, and that happens at a certain rate, which is constant for every kind of element. So some elements, for example, might decay in 500 million years, other might decay in 100 million years, and so on and so forth. These can be measured in the control condition in the laboratory. Obviously, we don't wait 100 million years to observe it. What we do is we put a lot of these atoms together, and we observe how many of them actually decay. So instead of observing a single atom for 100 million years, all you have to do is to observe 100 million atoms for a year. Okay? You get the same kind of information. Once that you have that, you can calibrate your clock, and you say, okay, look, if there is this ratio between the decayed product and the original product in a certain rock, then that rock is about X million years old or X thousands of years old, depending on what elements you're using. They're pretty reliable, and the interesting thing is that different kinds of dating based on different elements, when used on the same rock, they tend to give pretty much the same answers. Now, Now, notice that I'm keeping using the word pretty much or more or less and so on and so forth. And this is not because I want to be waffly about things, but because science is not, especially this kind of science, is not about exact answers. You always have a margin of error. The real question is how large is the margin of error? And the margin of error on most of these datings are actually very small.
Okay. Well, you have a few questions in here. When do you think that? Well, first of all, when did multicellular life appear? And when do you think? When did humans, or when did the organisms? How can I put this? When did? It's hard to explain. I'm looking at these questions here that Martin asking here. He said he thinks that you said humans split from plants 500 million years ago. I think he's joking, but when was that dramatic split? As evolutionary biologists determine when was that great split between plant life and animal life, etc.?
Okay, so the first question was about multicellular life. As far as we can tell, multicellular life originated about 1.5 billion, maybe 1.8 billion years ago. How do we know that? Because that's the time, those are the oldest rocks that actually contain any trace of multicellular life. Before that, we do have fossils. We have fossils, in fact, that now go back to 3.2 billion years ago, which is not much, by the way, after the origin of the Earth itself. But those more ancient fossils are unicellular. They're clearly bacterial cells. Now, it is very possible that I'm telling you this tonight, I'm telling you, say, 1.5 billion years ago, and then next week somebody publishes an article in Science or Nature saying, we found a multicellular organism that is 2 billion years or 2.2 billion years ago. In other words, what we can do is to put an upper limit. We know for sure that 1.5 billion years ago, multicellular life was already around. That doesn't mean that it originated 1.5 billion years ago. The fossil record, when you go that far back in time, it's very poor, it's very scant. So it could easily be another 500 million years, more than that. It's not that easy to find out. But certainly it's about that kind of order of magnitude. In terms of plants and humans, as I said, humans do not derive from plants. Plants and humans derive from a common ancestor, as do plants and fungi, for example, or animals and fungi, and so on and so forth. Now, when was that dramatic split? It's interesting that somebody used the word dramatic. Probably when it happened, it was not dramatic at all. All it happened was that one kind of small and simple multicellular life gave origin to a slightly different simple multicellular life form, neither of which looked at all either like a plant or like a human being. But that eventually kept diverging more and more, and over hundreds of millions of years became plants and animals. So at the time, the split certainly wasn't dramatic at all. When did that happen? Based on both the fossil record and the molecular biology, the DNA comparisons between larger groups of organisms, it likely happened around, again, 1 billion years ago, after the origin of multicellular life, probably.
So that's what I was going to ask. So there is evidence of this in the fossil record.
Oh, yeah.
Interesting. Do you have any? Well, would you happen to know any names of these off the top of your head?
Oh, no. I was interested. They can send me an email. I'll find the references.
Okay, great. How would they be able to contact you?
My email is simply my last name, Pigliucci, at utk.edu, University of Tennessee, Knoxville.
Okay. In fact, I'll type that in the chat room again. What was that again?
My last name?
Pigliucci, okay.
At utk.edu.
Okay. There we go. Okay. Are you a non-theist? Or how would you classify yourself as far as your belief or lack thereof?
Yeah, I think that's an accurate description. I'm not a non-theist. Most people would wonder what the difference is between a non-theist and an atheist.
Okay. And
the difference is really important depending on your definition of an atheist. If by atheist you mean somebody, literally, as it was the original meaning of the word, you mean somebody who does not have a belief in God, then I'm an atheist. But if by atheist you mean, as some people unfortunately mean today, somebody who is sure that there is no God, somebody who knows that there is no God, No, I'm not one of those. I don't know that there is no God. Nobody knows that there is or there isn't. But I think that there is a distinction between being an agnostic, which is somebody who doesn't pronounce himself and says, well, I don't know, therefore I'm not going to take a position, and a non-theist, or what I would call a reasonable atheist. A reasonable atheist or a non-theist is somebody who says, yes, that's true that technically we don't know if there is a God or not. It's also true, however, that everything that we understand about the world as it is leads to the conclusion, to the logical, not scientific, but to the logical conclusion that there is no such thing as a benign, omnipowerful, and omnipresent God. You can put it another way. If we were not talking about God and we were talking about some other topic, let's say, would it make sense to be agnostic about the existence of unicorns, for example? Probably not. You wouldn't find many agnostics about the existence of unicorns. You will find a unicornist. Most people, nobody knows if unicorns exist, because the only way to know if unicorns exist is to search the whole universe at all times and then figure out that, no, there is really no such thing as a unicorn. Obviously, nobody can do that. Nevertheless, we know enough about the fossil record and about animal physiology and so on and so forth, and especially about human mythology, because we know where unicorns came from. They were a mythological figure invented by human beings. That is very reasonable to conclude that, in fact, there are no unicorns. I think that the same kind of reasoning can be applied to God. I mean, we know where God comes from. We have a very detailed archaeological and historical record of different societies coming up with concepts of supernatural beings, and these concepts evolving from each other. The three major religions of the Judeo-Christian tradition, the Judeo-Christian Muslim tradition, one should say, are borrowed from each other, or built on each other, and even the original one, which would be Judaism, actually built and borrowed from a bunch of other peoples, including the Babylonians and the Assyrians and the Greeks. So you can actually trace the cultural evolution of God. People have done that, and there are several books that deal with this topic.
Okay. Someone in the chat room just asked, is there a philosophical link between evolution and atheism?
There's a philosophical link, which is a distinction between with a scientific link. There's no scientific link between evolution and atheism. And in fact, as a matter of fact, a lot of scientists and a lot of evolutionary biologists are believers. They're theists. Some of them are Christians. Some of them are a variety of other religions. And, of course, the word Christian in itself doesn't describe really anything because there's so many different varieties. It is true that there are very few, if any, scientists, evolutionary biologists who are fundamentalist Christians who believe in 6,000-year-old Earth and that kind of stuff. But there are many that are Christians. So there's no direct connection, scientific connection, meaning that just because evolution is true, that pure evolution is correct, that does not imply the non-existence of God from a scientific perspective. Now, does it imply from a philosophical perspective? I think so, at least of some kinds of God. I published an article a couple of years ago in Skeptic magazine, which actually made exactly this point. There are some kinds of gods that are definitely beyond scientific and even philosophical speculation. For example, if you are a deist, which is somebody who believes that for all effective purposes, God created the universe and then retired. It didn't do anything else afterwards. So God is essentially whatever started the universe, and then there was no intervention afterwards. There's no personal interest of God in human things, and so on and so forth. Well, that kind of belief is really very hard to attack. How can you disprove it? There's very little philosophical reasoning you can do, and certainly no scientific reasoning you can do to disprove that kind of position. That was the position, for example, of people, many exponents of the Enlightenment and many of the founding fathers of the United States, like Jefferson.
Right.
Now, on the other hand, if you believe that not only God exists, not only is omnipresent, omnipowerful, and very interested in your sex life, but in fact, he also created the earth 6,000 years ago, then I can tell you that you're wrong, period. And the reason I can tell you that you're wrong is not on philosophical grounds, but on scientific grounds. We know better. We know that the earth is much older than 6,000 years old. There is a certain amount of error, of course, on that estimate. Again, most people think that the earth is anywhere between 3.8 and 4.2 billion years ago old. But it's certainly not 6,000, 10,000, 100,000, or anything of that sort. If you believe certain religious traditions, for example, you would have to believe that the Earth is the center of the universe and it's flat. Well, we know better. So if you believe in that kind of God, I'm sorry, but I can tell from a scientific perspective that you're wrong. But if you believe in other kinds of God that are more general and less specific about the facts of the world, then there is nothing science can tell you. Then it becomes a philosophical question.
Well, that's interesting. It appears that what you're saying here is that the less characteristics these individuals give their deity, the easier it is to push it off into the realm of mysticism. But once again, that can even pertain to invisible pink unicorns as well.
Right. Yeah.
Once again, we're with Massimo Pigliucci. He is an associate professor at the University of Tennessee in the departments of botany and of ecology and evolutionary biology. And Mr. Massimo, you have a question here from Friso Viersma in the Netherlands.
Okay.
Okay, so first of all, an argument I have heard against evolution is that there are fossils found in transitional species, and you hit on this earlier in the show. I'm sure there are, as I use an example of humans, the Cro-Magnon, Australopithecus, and Homo erectus, etc. Is this a good example? And if not, can you give him a better example?
No, those are very good examples. Now, the thing to keep in mind is that those examples, the fossils that were found of, Australopithecus and Homo erectus, Homo habilis, and so on and so forth, may or may not be on the direct line of descent to humans, meaning that it is possible that some of those may have been literally your grand-grand-grand-grandfather or mother. It is also possible that they, on the other hand, were simply your cousins. Okay, so they were not on your direct line of descent, but they were on a side branch, essentially, of the evolutionary tree of humans. It, however, doesn't make any difference. The real point is there are transitional forms. If they were your cousins as opposed to your father and grandfather, it doesn't really make any difference from a point of view of evolutionary biology. The reason we think that humans evolved from a common ancestor with the great apes is because those links are in there. Several of the intermediate fossils look intermediate, and they're found at the right time in the geological column for being intermediate. And the other reason, of course, again, we do think that there is a common ancestor, was a common ancestor fairly recently between human beings and the chimps, is because the DNA of chimps and human beings is so close. There's only about 2.5% difference between our DNA and theirs.
Well, Massimo Pigliucci, I'm going to play angel's advocate here.
Okay.
Many creationists that I've come into contact with, one argument they utilize against that is that, human DNA is very similar to many different organisms. How would you respond?
Well, that is true, but it's the degree of similarity that is important.
Okay.
Since all organisms probably derived either from one or very few common ancestors, of course, the DNA of every organism is similar to the DNA of every other organism. As we said a little while ago when we were discussing oranges and bananas, human DNA is also fairly similar, remarkably similar, more than you would expect, to the DNA of plants. And that's how we know that plants and humans did share a common ancestors way back. Now, the problem is, however, that the difference between human DNA and typical plant DNA is much, much, much more than 2%. And so it's a matter of gradation, which is exactly, by the way, what the theory of evolution would predict. Think about it in terms, again, of your own family tree, if you wish.
Okay.
You share a lot of your DNA in common with your brothers, which in our analogy would be the chimpanzees, for example. You share less DNA with your cousins, which in our example would be, for example, gorillas, which are a little further related to human beings. And then if you go back in time, of course, you share quite a bit of DNA with your mother and father, but less so with your grandfather and grandmother, and less so with your grand-grand-grandfather or grand-grand-grand-grandmother, and so on and so forth. Meaning, in evolutionary terms, you share a lot of DNA in common with the common ancestor of human beings and great apes, but you share much less in common with the ancestor to all vertebrates, for example, which lived somewhere between about 550 million years ago or so. You shared even less DNA with the common ancestors of all vertebrates and invertebrates, that is, all animal taxa. And then you share, of course, even less DNA with the common ancestor to animals and plants, and then all the way further back until you share very little DNA with the common ancestors between humans and, say, bacteria. Mm-hmm. But that's exactly the pattern that evolutionary biology would predict, that there's this gradual change in the amount of DNA that you share with other organisms, which depends on how closely related you are to those other organisms. The more closely related you are, the more DNA you share. Since chimps are the organisms with which we share by far the largest amount of DNA, it is very logical to conclude that those are our most close relatives.
That makes sense. What about insects? I've heard people say that insects are totally unlike plants and animals. Is there anything in a fossil record that...
Actually, interestingly, the fossil record of insects is not that bad. One might think that since insects don't have the skeleton, they don't have bones or anything, so they don't fossilize very well. But in fact, they have an exoskeleton. That is, their skeleton essentially is outside of their body instead of inside like ours. Mm-hmm. And a lot of these actually do fossilize. So we have a fairly good historical record of the evolution of insects. And now, this is one of the interesting questions currently being investigated by evolutionary biologists. What is the animal group that is most closely related to insects? It's quite clear that insects are closely related to roundworms, and that they're certainly, of course, more closely related than that to things like spiders and organisms of that sort, which are not insects. So they're closely related to other arthropods, obviously. They're closely related to, for example, shrimp and things of that sort.
Well, that's what I've always called shrimp anyway. I call them aquatic insects.
Right, and for good reasons. They are, even though they are not insects actually, but they are closely related to insects. And then all of arthropods, that is, including insects and shrimp and things of that sort, are fairly closely related to probably to roundworms. That's the best guess that we can tell now from DNA analysis and from the fossil record. But it is very difficult because insects probably diverged from other invertebrates much further back than, of course, vertebrates did. Vertebrates originated much later than invertebrates to begin with. So insects have a long evolutionary history, which means that a lot of their fossil record is actually buried into sediments that are so old that we find very little fossils in them. So we have some ideas, and as I said, the best guess so far is that insects are closely related, relatively closely related to roundworms. But they're certainly more closely related to humans than they are to plants, that's for sure.
Interesting. And you say, and this is in the DNA evidence.
Yes, there's both DNA evidence and there are actually intermediate fossils in the record.
I would assume you said the roundworm because of worms don't have an endoskeleton, so they utilize the tough muscular tissue around
it. Right. Morphologically and developmentally, they're actually fairly similar to arthropods and to insects. They develop in
I didn't know that.
Remarkably similar ways, which may indicate similarity. That's how biologists before molecular biology, before the advent of molecular biology in the last 30 or 40 years, that's by looking at similarities in development of organisms and the fine structure of organisms. That's how they would come up with hypotheses about what was derived from what. Now that we have DNA evidence, things are getting better. By the way, molecular biology is still in its infancy, especially evolutionary molecular biology. So information on similarity of DNA of different organisms is coming in literally every day. There are hundreds of articles being published every day in the scientific literature, people looking at more and more genes and more organisms. So things may improve our understanding of the evolution, what is called sometimes deep evolution in deep geological time, may improve dramatically. If we were having this conversation in 5 years or 10 years, we might know a lot more than we do now. But right now, that's our best guess.
Okay. The Human Genome Project.
Yes.
What will this? Well, now that this is complete, I think now they're doing some other things. But what will it reveal about us, and what do you think that'll mean to? Even you're not a creationist, but I guess what do you think what impact would that have on creation scientists? Once the results of this get fully published, do you think will it change their minds at all, like anything?
I would bet that then that's not going to have much of an impact. I would say that the Human Genome Project, incidentally, is a large research effort done by a lot of simple, and it's giving us some interesting glimpse into how a human being is put together. But we are a long way from actually understanding how a human being is put together, just because we will be able to read the DNA sequence of the entire DNA sequence of a human being in a year or two. That doesn't translate that therefore you can build a human being from scratch. It's not that easy. The DNA is only one component of what makes an organism. There are a lot of other things that we don't understand. We don't understand a lot about how gene products interact with each other. We don't understand a lot about developmental biology of animals, and in particular human beings. And we certainly understand very little about how genes interact with their environment, which, as I said in the beginning, is the kind of stuff that actually interests me and where I do my active research. So we are a long way from understanding, if you wish, human nature, just because we're going to have the Human Genome Project completed.
Well, okay.
On the other hand, you would think that being able to complete that Human Genome Project and the project of other animals, incidentally, probably the chimp genome project is going to be the next thing, one of the next things. It's already in progress. Well, those you would think would provide very good evidence for the evolution by common descent of humans and other great apes. But that wouldn't change science per se. I mean, that's not why we're doing the Human Genome Project, because we already know that we share most recent common ancestor with chimps. It's not that we're spending these hundreds of millions of dollars to figure out that. We already know that one. What we're trying to figure out is what is the sequence of human genes, especially as it relates to health problems. The Human Genome Project is going to have mostly practical consequences in terms of medicine and human health more than basic scientific consequences. I don't think we're going to find out that much more that we already know about phylogenetic relationships of humans, that is, relationships of descent of humans with other primates. I mean, what we know is being confirmed by the Human Genome Project when we compared human genes to other primates, but it's nothing new has happened on that front.
Interesting. Well, okay. Massimo, we only have 2 more minutes left before the end of the show, and I have 2 more questions that I want to ask you. One is from a guy in the chat room here, Pad Erdy, whatever that means. Mm-hmm. What's the biggest, hottest controversy between evolutionists right now?
Oh, well, that's an interesting question. There probably is more than one, but I would say that one of the controversies is on the role of so-called genes with major effects. Let me explain what I mean by that. There are some mutations that have fairly large effects on the morphology or behavior of organisms. For example, you can produce a mutation in fruit flies, which doubles the number of their wings. Instead of having 2 wings, you create a fruit fly that has 4 wings. Mm-hmm. And for some time, people have been arguing that, well, look, isn't that interesting? There are other completely different classes of insects that actually have 4 wings, like dragonflies.
That's right. And
so it may be that a mutation of that sort is actually responsible for the changes between, fruit flies, for example, and dragonflies. Mm-hmm. Well, a lot of evolution biologists will say, no, not really. It may have happened that way, but it may have happened in a lot of different ways. It's not clear if, in fact, genes that have that kind of dramatic effect, the sort of instantaneous or almost instantaneous effect, actually have played a major role in evolution. And the reason for that is because most of those mutations are, in fact, deleterious. The flies with 4 wings are not very happy. They die very easily. They don't do very well. They don't reproduce very well, and so on. So they're deleterious mutations, and therefore one of the questions, the raging discussions right now is, what is, if any, the role of these kind of mutations? They can be used under laboratory conditions to understand how a fly or an organism is put together. Okay, because once you modify the DNA and you see what effect that DNA modification has, you have understood something more about how that organism actually put together from a point of view of developmental biology. But does that also tell you something about the evolution of that organism? I think that is a very much open question. My personal preference would be for yes and no. It may be that occasionally mutations with major effects did have did play some role in evolution, but but by and large, I would guess that they did not.
Okay. And the last question, we're going a little over, I think, I'm not quite sure. The last question, what is the biggest, hottest controversy between evolutionists and creationists?
Well, everything, I would say, right? There's a complete divide there. There's non-agreement on essentially anything. But I would say that the most important aspect of that controversy is the teaching of evolution in public schools, which, of course, is not a scientific question. It's an education and public policy question. The question is essentially the argument can go this way. The creationist would say, look, a lot of people think that creation is a valid alternative to evolution. Therefore, we should teach it in public schools because you cannot dismiss what 40% or 45% of the population thinks just because the experts say that it's not true. The scientist would respond that, look, education's got nothing to do with majority rule. Education is done by professionals, and what we teach is the best of what we know. If it turns out that what we know is wrong, we'll change it. But until we think that is the best thing that we know, that's what we're going to teach. And of course, as you might imagine, I'm on the latter side. I really do think that there is a misconception, especially in the United States, about the role of the public in education. It seems to me very interesting that Americans, like a lot of other people, do have a certain respect and use for experts in almost all fields except education. I mean, most people wouldn't go to a brain surgeon for an operation and start arguing with him about the best way of cutting open their brain.
Right.
They would just go in the operation on the operation table and hope that surgeon was well trained by whatever university trained him or her, and that she's going to do a good job. On the other hand, when it comes down to education, a lot of people who know nothing about science, biology, evolution, or anything of the sort, don't hesitate for a moment to go up to the teacher and say, no, you're not supposed to be teaching this, you should be teaching that instead because it makes more sense. That seems to me a very arrogant perspective. It is really like saying that education is really not a profession. Anybody could do it if they had enough time or will to do it. And therefore, anybody can walk up to a teacher and tell her what to do and what not to do. In most other Western countries, it doesn't work that way. Teachers are as respected as other professionals. That doesn't mean that they're semi-gods. That doesn't mean that they don't make mistakes. And certainly that doesn't mean that the level of teaching of science in our schools is as good as it could be. But it does mean that coming up with sometimes very simplistic objections based on hearsay or reading of a few articles to what is taught on the basis of what a lot of professionals have put a lot of time to understand, it's at least naive, if not, as I said, even downright arrogant.
Wow. Well, Massimo, this has been a great show. I really enjoyed having you on.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun.
Is there anything that you'd like to leave with our listeners, before you leave?
Just keep doing these things. Keep listening to these shows. Keep reading and keep thinking on your own. It doesn't matter what conclusion you're going to reach. It's all in the process. What matters really is the process of critical thinking and informed thinking, regardless of what your conclusions are actually going to be.
Well, thank you. And if you want to find out more about Massimo, you can see his write-up here on the website. You can go to him on the web, and you can find out more about his book. Well, I'm going to sign off, and I'm going to talk to you after the show. Once again, thank you all for joining the Infidel Guy Real Audio Show, and I'll come meet you in chat in a second. Thank you for joining.
Infidel Guy stepping in here. Thank you so much for taking time to take a listen. I know it's been a while, and the audio is horrible, but it gets better, I hope, over time. Back then, all I had was a speakerphone. I had a microphone that I was crouching over and speaking into at the same time my guest was talking into the same speakerphone. So it's kind of going out and going back in again. It was a mess, but thank you so much. I really appreciate it, because before the first shows I had before this, it was really just me, and I didn't have any guests, and I pre-recorded all of those programs. Then I started doing them live, and it was still just me, just ranting about various topics of the day, dealing with religion, philosophy, theology, pseudoscience, stuff like that. And then I realized, and actually people were asking me, why don't you interview this person? And I started thinking, well, how can I bring people in? And so that's how that was born. It was through this really cheap, I think it was like a $40 Radio Shack speakerphone that I got. And but anyway, that well, it brings back so many memories. I get goosebumps actually just listening to it and cringe at the same time. But I had some amazing guests, as you can see, and it's amazing how they really influenced me in who I became later on as well, via my career in education and science. And for those who probably haven't been keeping up over the years, again, I'm now Dr. Reginald Finley, and I have a PhD now in science education, a master's in biology, a master's in another master's in science education, bachelor's in human development, and a few other degrees. And I've just kept at it really because I've been inspired. I just love to learn, and I figured why not get a degree? What I didn't expect is how broke I was going to be later. But anyway, I think that's a common story of most uh, PhD holders, anyways, that we tend to be broke for a number of years, especially if we don't get scholarships or anything like that. But anyway, I digress. Stay tuned. Next time, we're going to have Edward Kagan, who is the founder of CampQuest, on. May he rest in peace. Wonderful guy. I really enjoy talking to him. I've met him a few times even after the interview, and I think you'll enjoy it. Again, just be patient with the audio. I have right now my audio engineer trying his best, but you can imagine how much worse it sounded before he got his hands on it. But anyway, I'll see you next time, and keep stopping by and hit that bell notification because I will come in from time to time to do some audio myself and even have guests on in the future and things like that. But right now, we're trying to get all of these programs up, not as soon as we can, but as often as we can, so that it just doesn't stay on my hard drive or stay at the infidelguy.com site, which is always at risk of being hacked or audio files getting deleted mistakenly or whatever. So, yep, we're going to just put them all up here on on Infidel Guy on YouTube, and hopefully, the YouTube will be around for a while. We don't know. All right, thanks, guys. See you later.